In the quiet ecosystem of a living room, where the scent of expensive candles and the hum of polite conversation usually reign supreme, there exists a hidden predator, the misplaced piece of high-end technology. It lies in wait beneath the velvet throw pillows, camouflaged by the shadows of a well-lit social gathering, waiting for the precise moment when gravity and a moment of relaxed focus collide. Little did she know, as the cushions yielded beneath her weight with a sickening, synthetic crunch, that it was something much worse than a spilled cocktail or a social faux pas. It was the birth of a fiscal vendetta that would transform a friendly afternoon into a high-stakes legal chess match, proving that when the screen shatters, so too does the thin veneer of civility. Beatrice prided herself on being a host of some repute, the kind of person who could balance a glass of Pinot Noir in one hand and a witty anecdote in the other without ever breaking a sweat. Her apartment was a sanctuary of curated aesthetics, a space where friends and friends of friends gathered to dissect the mundane dramas of their mid-20s. On this particular Saturday, the air was thick with the rhythmic pulse of lo-fi beats and the chatter of a dozen guests. Among the attendees was Alois, an acquaintance brought along by a mutual friend, whose presence was as unassuming as the sleek, silver MacBook she had carelessly tucked into the crevice of the sectional sofa. The catastrophe occurred at approximately 4:15 p.m. Beatrice, seeking a moment of respite from a particularly grueling conversation about artisanal sourdough starters, drifted toward the corner of her L-shaped couch. With the graceful exhaustion of a hostess who had been on her feet for hours, she let herself drop. The impact was not cushioned by the soft foam she expected, but rather by the unyielding resistance of aluminum and glass. The sound was unmistakable, a sharp, crystalline pop that silenced the immediate vicinity. For a heartbeat, time suspended itself. Beatrice froze, her weight still pressing down on the hidden object. When she rose, she revealed the victim, Alois's laptop, its screen now a spiderweb of obsidian cracks and digital bleeding. Alois let out a gasp that was half theatrical and half genuine horror, rushing toward the sofa like a mother toward a fallen child. The room descended into that peculiar brand of awkwardness that only property damage can induce, where everyone suddenly becomes very interested in the ice cubes in their glasses. "I am so incredibly sorry," Beatrice stammered, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She wasn't one to shy away from responsibility. Her moral compass was, perhaps to a fault, calibrated toward immediate restitution. "It was entirely my fault. I didn't see it there. Please, let me make this right. I'll pay for the replacement." Alois, cradling the wounded device, looked up with wide, shimmering eyes. "It's my whole life," she whispered, though the device was clearly a few years old and likely backed up to the cloud. "It cost $2,200 when I bought it. I don't even know if it can be saved." Beatrice, desperate to dissolve the tension and restore the harmony of her home, nodded fervently. "Whatever it takes, $2,200, I'll wire it to you. Give me a week to move some funds around, and I'll put it straight into your bank account. I promise." At that moment, the pact seemed sealed by the shared trauma of the incident. Alois offered a weak, forgiving smile, and the party eventually resumed, though the MacBook incident remained a heavy, invisible guest at the table. Beatrice spent the rest of the evening mentally auditing her savings account, mourning the loss of her vacation fund, but comforted by the thought that she was doing the noble thing. She was a woman of her word, and in the world of high-velocity social circles, her reputation for integrity was worth more than a few $1,000s. However, the following Monday brought a chill that had nothing to do with the California weather. An email landed in Beatrice's inbox, the subject line a deceptively simple laptop replacement. Opening it, Beatrice expected a bank routing number and a polite thank you. Instead, she found a cold, itemized demand. "Hi, Beatrice," the email began, its tone stripped of the previous Saturday's softness. "As per our conversation, I'm expecting the $2,700 we agreed upon. Since my old model is no longer the top of the line and I was planning on upgrading anyway, it only makes sense for you to cover the cost of the current Pro model. I'm sure you understand that anything less wouldn't truly make me whole. Let me know when the wire is sent. Best, Alois." Beatrice stared at the screen, her grip tightening on her phone. $2,700? They had never agreed to such a figure. The upgrading anyway clause felt like a slap in the face, a blatant attempt to turn a genuine accident into a subsidized shopping spree. The audacity of the request was a sharp needle popping the balloon of Beatrice's guilt. She realized then that she wasn't dealing with a grieving tech owner. She was dealing with an opportunist who saw a broken screen as a golden ticket. Refusing to be intimidated, Beatrice secured Alois's phone number and dialed. The conversation was a masterclass in passive-aggressive maneuvering. Alois's voice was airy, almost bored, as she explained that it was standard procedure to replace a damaged item with its modern equivalent. When Beatrice pointed out that she was essentially being asked to pay a $500 convenience fee for Alois's lifestyle choices, the tone turned razor-sharp. "Look, Beatrice," Alois snapped, the mask of the polite guest finally slipping. "You broke it. You pay for it. If you can't handle the $2,700, I'm more than happy to let a judge in small claims court decide what's fair. I'm sure they'll love hearing how you crushed a guest's property because you couldn't bother to look where you were sitting." The threat hung in the air, cold and litigious. Beatrice hung up, the red mist of anger beginning to cloud her judgment. She was at a crossroads. She could swallow the bitter pill of the $2,700 to make the problem vanish, or she could dig in her heels and prepare for a war of attrition. She turned to the only place she knew where thousands of strangers would be happy to dissect her personal failures: the internet. The advice flooded in like a torrential rain. The digital masses were nearly unanimous. Alois was overreaching, and the law, notoriously unsympathetic to those seeking a windfall, would likely agree. Empowered by the collective wisdom of the hive mind, Beatrice began to do what she should have done from the start. She began to research. She looked up the specific serial number of the mangled MacBook. She called repair shops. She looked at the market value for 3-year-old electronics. What she discovered changed the entire complexion of the conflict. A replacement screen for that specific model wasn't $2,200. It wasn't even $1,000. It was a mere $310 for the part, plus a modest labor fee. The total loss Alois had claimed was a fabrication. The realization hit Beatrice like a cold splash of water. She had been ready to hand over a small fortune for a repair that cost less than a fancy dinner for 4. Armed with this new data, Beatrice sat down to compose a final email. Gone was the apologetic hostess. In her place was a woman who had spent 3 hours reading California civil codes. She informed Alois that since the initial offer of $2,200 had been rejected in favor of an extortionate demand, that offer was now officially off the table. She was now offering the cost of a professional repair and not a penny more. The response was instantaneous. It wasn't an email, it was a digital scream. Alois's reply was a string of insults, culminating in the word bitch and a vow that they would meet in court. Beatrice felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. The battle lines were drawn, and the cozy living room drama was about to move to a much more formal stage. The legal machinery of the state of California is famously indifferent to the social nuances of friendship. And as Beatrice discovered when the process server arrived at her door, it is also remarkably efficient at turning a private spat into a public record. The summons was a crisp, intimidating stack of papers that formalized Alois's hubris. In black and white, the demand for $2,700 sat alongside a narrative that painted Beatrice as a reckless, destructive force of nature, who had flattened a vital piece of professional equipment without a second thought. Beatrice spent the following week in a state of meticulous preparation that bordered on the obsessive. She had moved past the stage of anxiety and entered a phase of cold, calculated pragmatism. Her dining table, once the site of cheese boards and wine pairings, was now a war room covered in printed spreadsheets, eBay listings for mid-range electronics, and a highlighted copy of the California Small Claims Handbook. She knew that in the eyes of the law, being a nice person was not a valid defense, but market value was a concrete wall that Alois was about to run into at full speed. She spent hours at a local repair shop, chatting with a technician named Marcus, who looked at the photos of the cracked screen with the weary eyes of a man who had seen 1,000 such casualties. "It's a clean break, purely cosmetic to the display," Marcus noted, tapping his screwdriver against the counter. "The logic board is fine. The chassis isn't even bent. This isn't a total loss, it's a $300 fix. Anyone asking for $3,000 is looking for a down payment on a car, not a laptop." Beatrice nodded, noting down his quote. She also took the liberty of sourcing prices for refurbished models of the exact same age and specification. The data was damning. A 3-year-old MacBook Pro was no longer the $2,200 Titan it had been at the Apple Store in 2021. In the brutal world of tech depreciation, it was now worth roughly $1,400 on a good day. Eloise's demand for $2,700 wasn't just an upgrade. It was an attempt at a 100% profit on a used item. The morning of the hearing arrived with a sky the color of galvanized steel. Beatrice dressed in a sharp, conservative blazer, the kind of outfit that whispered responsible citizen and meticulous record keeper. She arrived at the courthouse early, clutching a neat accordion folder that contained the DNA of her defense. As she sat in the hallway, she saw Eloise march in, looking less like a victim and more like a woman who had already spent the money she hadn't yet won. Eloise was accompanied by the mutual friend who had introduced them, a woman named Clara, who looked profoundly uncomfortable to be caught in the crossfire of a legal skirmish. When their eyes met, Eloise didn't offer a nod of recognition or a moment of shared history. Instead, she gave Beatrice a look of such pure, distilled condescension that any lingering droplets of guilt in Beatrice's heart evaporated instantly. This was no longer about a laptop. It was about the fundamental principle of not being a doormat. When the bailiff finally called their case, the atmosphere in the small courtroom was sterile and intimidating. The judge, a formidable woman named Justice Miller, sat behind a high mahogany bench, her expression unreadable behind a pair of heavy-rimmed spectacles. She looked like a person who had very little patience for the he said, she said of domestic disputes and a very high appreciation for documented facts. Case number 442, Eloise versus Beatrice, the judge intoned, her voice echoing in the quiet room. The plaintiff is seeking damages in the amount of $2,700 for the destruction of personal property. Is that correct? Eloise stood up, smoothing her skirt with a practiced air of fragility. Yes, Your Honor. I was a guest in the defendant's home when she sat on my laptop with such force that it was rendered completely useless. This was my primary tool for work, and I had only recently purchased it. Because it's a discontinued model, the cost to replace it with the current equivalent, which is what I need to maintain my livelihood, is $2,700. Beatrice watched as the judge scribbled something on a notepad. Eloise continued, her voice gaining a theatrical quiver. I tried to be reasonable, Your Honor. I even gave Beatrice a week to pay, but instead of taking responsibility, she became hostile and tried to lowball me with repair costs for a machine that will never be the same again. Thank you, Justice Miller said, her tone clipped. She turned her gaze to Beatrice. And the defendant's position. Beatrice stood, her hands steady as she opened her folder. She didn't look at Eloise. She looked directly at the bench. Your Honor, I have never denied that I sat on the laptop. It was an accident for which I took immediate responsibility. However, the plaintiff's claim that I am responsible for a $2,700 upgrade is legally and factually unsupported. I would like to present the court with 3 options I offered the plaintiff before we reached this point. She handed a packet of documents to the bailiff to be passed to the judge. Option 1, Beatrice continued, her voice clear and resonant, was a check for $2,200, which was the original purchase price. This was a gesture of goodwill I made before I understood the actual value of the used device. The plaintiff rejected this because she wanted cash, not a direct replacement, and later increased her demand to $2,700. The judge flipped through the emails Beatrice had provided. The bitch email was right on top, highlighted for maximum visibility. Justice Miller's eyebrows climbed toward her hairline as she read the colorful language Eloise had used to decline a $2,000 settlement. Option 2, Beatrice said, was a refurbished model of the exact same year and specs, which markets for $1,400. And option 3 was a professional repair of the screen, which is the only damaged component, costing approximately $310. I have included quotes from 3 different certified Apple repair centers and current market listings for the device in question. The silence in the courtroom was heavy. Eloise began to fidget, her confident posture beginning to wilt under the judge's intensifying stare. Beatrice wasn't finished. Furthermore, Your Honor, the laptop was left on a dark-colored sofa in a crowded room during a social gathering. It was tucked into a cushion where it was not visible to anyone sitting down. I contend that leaving a sensitive piece of electronic equipment in a high-traffic seating area constitutes a significant degree of contributory negligence. Justice Miller looked up from the papers, her eyes fixing on Alois. Plaintiff, is it true that you were offered $2,200 for a 3-year-old laptop and you turned it down because you wanted an upgrade? I needed a reliable machine for my work, Your Honor. Alois stammered, the attitude Beatrice had noticed earlier beginning to leak into her voice. I shouldn't have to settle for a used version of my own property. In this courtroom, the judge said, her voice dropping an octave in warning, you are entitled to be made whole, not to be made better off than you were before the accident. You are seeking a windfall. Alois's face turned a mottled shade of red. But she's the one who sat on it. It's her fault. She should be happy I'm only asking for $2,700. The judge leaned forward, the clicking of her pen the only sound in the room. The way you speak to this court, and the way you spoke to the defendant in these emails, suggests a profound misunderstanding of how liability works. And quite frankly, I find your conduct to be remarkably ungrateful. Beatrice felt a surge of quiet triumph. The tide hadn't just turned, it had become a tsunami. The courtroom felt smaller as the air grew thick with the palpable frustration of Justice Miller, who was now staring at Alois with the weary disappointment of a teacher watching a student fail an open-book exam. Alois, however, seemed entirely oblivious to the shifting atmosphere. Her initial facade of the wronged victim had been replaced by a sharp, defensive arrogance that suggested she believed the sheer volume of her indignation could override the basic tenets of property law. Your Honor, you don't understand, Alois interjected, her voice rising to a pitch that echoed unpleasantly off the linoleum floors. That laptop wasn't just used. It was pristine. It was mine. The idea that I should have to go through the hassle of a repair or take some second-hand machine that someone else's hands have touched is insulting. Beatrice broke the social contract the second she sat down without looking. She's lucky I'm not suing for the emotional distress and the lost billable hours. Beatrice remained perfectly still, her hands folded neatly atop her accordion folder. She had learned from her research that in a courtroom, silence is often the most devastating weapon. Every time Alois spoke, she was digging the hole deeper, and Beatrice had no intention of handing her a ladder. Justice Miller looked down at the screenshots Beatrice had provided, specifically the one where Alois had called Beatrice a bitch and demanded the extra $500 for the mandatory upgrade. The judge's lips thinned into a hard, straight line. Ms. Alois, the judge said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, low rumble. This court is not a wishing well. You are here to seek restitution for a loss, not to negotiate a premium for your inconvenience. You were offered nearly double the market value of your device in a gesture of friendship, and you chose to respond with vitriol and a demand for a profit. It's not a profit, Alois snapped, her face flushing. It's the cost of doing business. If she didn't want to pay, she shouldn't have been so careless. The judge turned her attention back to Beatrice. And regarding the placement of the laptop, Ms. Beatrice, you say it was hidden. Yes, Your Honor, Beatrice replied, her voice calm and measured. I have here a photo of the couch in question. It's a charcoal-colored velvet. The laptop, being space gray and closed, was tucked into the corner where the back cushion meets the seat. At 4:00 p.m. on a winter afternoon with 12 people in the room, it was effectively invisible. I've also included a statement from Clara, our mutual friend, who admits she almost sat on it herself 20 minutes prior. The judge leaned back, eyeing the photo. A couch, Justice Miller mused, almost to herself, is a piece of furniture designed specifically for the purpose of human beings sitting upon it. It is not, by any reasonable standard, a storage shelf for fragile, high-end electronics in the middle of a social gathering. Alois let out a scoff that was loud enough to be a verbal assault. So what? I'm supposed to just hold it in my lap the whole time? It's a laptop. It belongs where I put it. Actually, Justice Miller countered, her voice sharp as a gavel strike, it belongs in a place where it won't be crushed. There is a concept in California law called comparative negligence. It means that we look at the actions of both parties to determine who is truly at fault for the damage. While Ms. Beatrice did provide the physical force that broke the screen, You, Ms. Alois, provided the circumstances that made that accident almost inevitable. Beatrice felt a thrill of validation. The hours spent scrolling through legal forums and reading about duty of care were finally paying off. She watched as Alois's eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape or an ally, but Clara was currently staring at her own shoes, trying to disappear into the gallery benches. "I have seen enough," Justice Miller announced, reaching for her pen. "This is a case of an accident born from mutual thoughtlessness, compounded by one party's extraordinary greed. Ms. Beatrice made multiple, more-than-fair attempts to resolve this privately. She offered you a brand-new current model's price out of the goodness of her heart, an offer you were foolish enough to reject because you wanted even more." The judge began writing on the official judgment form, the scratching of the pen the only sound in the tense room. Alois stood frozen, her mouth slightly agape, as if she couldn't believe the narrative wasn't bending to her will. "The market value of a 3-year-old MacBook is approximately $1,400, the judge stated, not looking up. However, the evidence provided by the defendant shows that the device is fully functional aside from the screen. A repair is the most reasonable path to making the plaintiff whole. The cost of that repair is $310 plus labor, totaling $450. Because the plaintiff was 50% responsible for the damage by leaving the item in a hazardous location, I am awarding the plaintiff only 50% of the repair cost." Alois's knees seemed to buckle slightly. "What, $200? Are you joking?" "I am not joking," Justice Miller said, finally looking up with a gaze that could have withered a redwood tree. "I am ruling that the defendant, Ms. Beatrice, owes the plaintiff the sum of $225. No more, no less. And let the record show that had the plaintiff accepted the initial, incredibly generous offer of $2,200, we would not be here today wasting the court's time with your attempt to grift a former friend." The bailiff stepped forward, signaling that the hearing was over. Beatrice felt a wave of relief so powerful it made her lightheaded. She began to pack her folders, her movements slow and deliberate. Across the aisle, Alois was trembling, her hands balled into fists. The look Beatrice had been imagining for weeks, the one where the predator realizes they've become the prey, was finally etched onto Alois's face. As they moved toward the exit, the hallway of the courthouse felt wider and brighter than it had an hour ago. Beatrice walked with a straight back, the weight of the $2,700 threat finally lifted from her shoulders. She had won, but more importantly, she had stood her ground against a bully who thought a shattered screen was an invitation to a bank heist. Alois caught up to her near the elevators, her face a mask of cold fury. "You think you've won?" she hissed, her voice low so the nearby guards wouldn't hear. "You ruined my laptop and then cheated me out of the money to fix it. You're a horrible person, Beatrice. I hope you're proud of yourself." Beatrice stopped and turned, meeting Alois's eyes with a calm, pitying smile. "Actually, Alois, I am proud. I learned that my integrity has a price, and apparently your friendship is worth exactly $225. I'll mail you the check. Don't worry, I'll make sure it doesn't bounce, unlike your case." The silence that followed Beatrice's parting shot in the courthouse corridor was heavy with the scent of floor wax and the bitter realization of a failed shakedown. Alois stood motionless by the elevators, her jaw working silently as she searched for a retort that wouldn't come. The power dynamic had shifted so violently that the very air between them felt different. The victim was now merely a defeated litigant, and the aggressor was a woman who had successfully defended her boundaries with the precision of a surgeon. As Beatrice stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, the sunlight felt like a victory lap. She felt a profound sense of lightness, the kind that only comes when a looming shadow is finally dispelled by the cold light of truth. She headed toward a nearby cafe, needing a moment to decompress and let the adrenaline subside. As she waited for her latte, she pulled out her phone and saw a flurry of messages from Clara, who had beat a hasty retreat from the courtroom the moment the judgment was read. "I am so sorry," Clara's text read. "I had no idea Alois was going to be that aggressive. I just thought she was stressed about her tech. I feel terrible for bringing her into your home." Beatrice sighed, realizing that while she had won the legal battle, the social debris of the incident would take longer to clear. She typed back a short, neutral response, acknowledging that while the introduction had been a disaster, the responsibility for the behavior lay solely with Alois. The following days were a study in the aftermath of a digital age dispute. Beatrice sat down at her desk, the very place where she had spent nights researching California civil codes, and wrote out a check for exactly $225. She took a photograph of the check, then a photograph of the envelope, and finally a photograph of herself dropping it into the blue USPS collection box. In a world where Alois had already proven herself capable of distorting reality, Beatrice was leaving nothing to chance. She was building a fortress of evidence, one stamp at a time. News of the MacBook trial spread through their social circle with the speed of a viral meme. In the ecosystem of their friend group, where drama was usually limited to ghosting and accidental Instagram likes, a small claims court victory was legendary. Beatrice found herself being treated with a new level of respect, or perhaps a healthy dose of caution. People realized that beneath her hospitable exterior lay a backbone of reinforced steel. However, the victory wasn't just about the money. For Beatrice, the true prize was the education she had received in the mechanics of human greed. She had watched a person she barely knew try to leverage a moment of clumsy misfortune into a payday that would have paid her rent for 2 months. She had seen how quickly a friend of a friend could weaponize a polite request into a legal threat when they sensed a weakness. A week later, Beatrice received a notification on her phone. It was an email from Alois, but there were no insults this time. No bitches, no threats, no demands for upgrades. It was simply a confirmation that the check had been received and deposited. The brevity was a white flag. The battle was over, the debt was settled, and the $2,475 difference between Alois's demand and the judge's ruling remained safely in Beatrice's savings account. That evening, Beatrice invited a few of her closest, most trusted friends over the ones who had been there before the MacBook incident and who had stayed through the fallout. As they sat around the same living room where the catastrophe had occurred, the mood was celebratory but reflective. Beatrice looked at the charcoal velvet sofa, now conspicuously clear of any electronics. "So," her friend Julian said, lifting a glass of champagne, "is the couch officially open for business again?" Beatrice laughed, a genuine, easy sound that signaled the end of her ordeal. "The couch is open," she said, "but the bank is closed. And from now on, I think I'll be implementing a mandatory check your pockets and your cushions policy before anyone sits down. I've had enough litigation to last a lifetime." As the night wore on, the conversation drifted away from the court case and back to the rhythms of their normal lives. The drama that had consumed Beatrice's every waking thought for a month was finally receding into the past, becoming just another story to tell over drinks. She had lost a potential friend in Alois, but she had gained something far more valuable: the knowledge that she could stand in the middle of a storm, armed only with the facts and a folder of eBay screenshots, and come out the other side unscathed. The lesson was expensive in terms of stress, but cheap in terms of currency. For $225, Beatrice had purchased a masterclass in self-advocacy. She looked around her apartment, her sanctuary, and felt a deep sense of peace. The screen was broken, the friendship was shattered, but the hostess remained undefeated. The final chapter of the saga did not conclude with a dramatic confrontation or a cinematic apology, but rather with the quiet, satisfying hum of a life restored to its proper frequency. In the weeks following the settlement, Beatrice found that her apartment felt larger, the air within it cleaner, as if the departure of Alois's lingering entitlement had cleared a psychic smog that had been choking the hallways. She had survived the peculiar modern warfare of the small claims court, and the spoils of war were a renewed sense of agency and a bank account that remained comfortably intact. She decided to mark the official end of the era with a small, symbolic gesture. She took the $2,000 she had originally intended to hand over to Alois, the money she had mentally categorized as lost during those first days of panic, and treated herself to a high-quality, professional-grade steamer for her sofa and a set of elegant, sculptural side tables. The message was clear. If a guest felt the need to set down their expensive toys, they now had a designated, visible surface on which to do so. The cushion trap was officially retired. The social ripple effects, however, continued to shimmer. Clara, the mutual friend who had unintentionally invited a shark into Beatrice's living room, eventually reached out for a face-to-face meeting. Over coffee in a neutral corner of the city, Clara confessed that she had ended her friendship with Alois shortly after the hearing. "It wasn't just the money," Clara explained, stirring her drink with a somber expression. "It was the way she looked at you in that courtroom. It was the way she talked about getting what she was owed. I realized that to her, people are just potential payouts. I couldn't unsee that." Beatrice listened, realizing that the shattered MacBook had acted like a stress test for everyone's character. In the high-pressure environment of the dispute, she had seen who offered support, who offered advice, and who simply stepped back to watch the carnage. She found herself pruning her own social circle with a newfound discernment, no longer feeling the need to be the nice girl at the expense of her own peace of mind. The cost of a friendship, she now knew, was not measured in years or shared interests, but in the way they handled a crisis. One rainy Tuesday, a final piece of mail arrived regarding the case. It was a formal notification from the court that the judgment had been satisfied and the file was officially closed. Beatrice held the paper for a moment, tracing the embossed seal of the state of California. She thought back to the moment she had felt the sickening crunch of the screen beneath her. At the time, she had felt like a villain, a clumsy destroyer of someone's world. Now, she realized she had been a catalyst for a very necessary revelation. She tucked the paper into a drawer, not as a trophy of a legal win, but as a reminder of the power of preparation. She had entered that courtroom expecting a fight, but she had won because she brought a map of the truth while her opponent brought only a bag of demands. The internet strangers who had guided her, the repairman who had demystified the tech, and the judge who had seen through the theatricality. They were the architects of a victory that felt more like a graduation. That evening, Beatrice sat on her couch with her own laptop, ironically, the same brand as the one she had crushed. She felt the support of the cushions, the familiar give of the fabric, and the warmth of a home that was no longer a potential crime scene. She opened a blank document and began to write, not a legal defense this time, but a thank you note to the forum that had first pointed her toward the truth. She shared the final tally: the $225 check, the judge's sharp words, and the look of pure, unadulterated shock on the face of a woman who thought she could turn an accident into an investment. As she hit send, she felt the final thread of the drama snap. The story was out of her hands now, floating in the digital ether where it would serve as a cautionary tale for future hosts and a beacon of hope for anyone being bullied by an upgrading friend. Beatrice closed her laptop, carefully placing it on the new side table, and leaned back into the velvet. For the first time in months, she wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop or the next email to ping. She was simply home, and the silence was exquisite. The MacBook incident was over. The host had reclaimed her house, the guest had been revealed as a grifter, and the law had proven that while mistakes are made by sitting down, true character is revealed in how we stand back up. Beatrice reached for her book, a glass of wine by her side, and let the quiet of a Tuesday night wash over her, finally and completely whole.